Hi, I'm Ian Roberts. I've been teaching painting workshops for about 10 years, and if there's one thing that seems most elusive to almost everyone, it's developing strong compositions. No matter what grips you most in the painting process, whether it's vibrant color or bold brushwork, still lifes, portraits, or painting en plein air or working in your studio from photographs, composition is what everything is built on. I'm in Taos, New Mexico, teaching 2 plein air painting workshops, and while here, we're filming a 7-part video course on the fundamentals of building strong compositions. Part 1 is looking at the importance of thinking of your painting as a series or arrangement of abstract shapes, rather than as a subject, say, of trees or people. Part 2 will look at the importance of armature to structure or hang your painting from. Part 3 will look at how your eye moves in the picture plane, and how this one idea, this one skill, will help you immeasurably when you're actually painting your painting. Part 4 will be looking at framing and cropping what you've found so you can get the most dramatic and powerful composition from it. Part 5 will look at value and color shapes as the building blocks of your painting. Part 6 will be looking at a series of critiques of the students here in Taos. Part 7 will be a demonstration that I do that takes everything that we've looked at and puts it into practice. So now we'll look at a few of my paintings while we listen to a quote by John Cannaday, the art historian, who was asked by Time Life in the Metropolitan Museum in New York to do a series on the history and appreciation of Western art.
Composition is so fundamental to the creation of pictures that a list of the world's greatest pictures would overlap a list of the greatest compositions in a majority of titles. Yet of all the elements in the art of painting, composition is the one least recognized by the average observer, even when it is playing a major part in his reaction to a picture.
The art historian John Cannaday didn't think there were very many paintings he could think of that were great paintings that didn't have as their foundation a great composition. And I must say I feel the same. I can't think of a painting that I really admire that doesn't have at its basis a strong composition. And yet something so basic to great painting, or even good painting, never seems to be isolated, addressed, and taught. Truly great compositions may be elusive to both create and understand, but some aspects of it must be possible to understand how they work and why. So the nuts and bolts of making great paintings, or even good paintings, may be something that we can look at and analyze so that our paintings are well composed and people can read them, can see them, can appreciate them easily and consistently. Most paintings fail in the first 30 seconds or so because the way the idea is framed and seen is not strong enough, is not dynamic enough. So what's the secret of making great compositions? Let's listen to what 3 artists have to say and see if they can give us a clue to this elusive idea.
As music is the poetry of sound, so is painting the poetry of sight. And the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or color. Remember that a picture, before being a battle horse, a nude woman, or some anecdote, is essentially a plain surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. There is a species of emotion particular to painting. There is an effect that results from a certain arrangement of color and lights, of shadows. It is this that one calls the music of painting.
What is central to these 3 quotes? What the artists are saying is that we respond rather than to subjects to an abstract relationship of forms and shapes. Whistler even called his paintings arrangement in gray and pink, and his famous painting in the Louvre, which we normally know as Whistler's mother, is called Arrangement in Gray and Black, No. 1. So these artists recommended looking at paintings as design or composition driven, not subject driven. This is the most important idea here, and we're going to isolate and address this idea through the course of this video with some exercises and illustrations to make it clear. As we noticed from the comments of Whistler and Vuillard, the composition is the force in the painting. It is the abstract design behind the painting that we enjoy. And there's basically 2 kinds. 2-dimensional, where the pattern of those abstract shapes is primary, And we can think of, say, Matisse or a Japanese woodblock as examples of those. And three-dimensional, where the image is sculpted into the picture plane. Now we're going to look at the work of a great abstract painter, Andrew Wyatt. Look at how abstract and beautiful these compositions are. You may say, but wait, he's known for his detailed representational paintings. But behind every painting are the abstract masses that make the composition work. Paul Valéry, the French poet, said to see is to forget the name of the thing one sees. And what we'll be looking at and addressing is looking at arrangements of shapes, abstract shapes, and building the foundation of our painting from there up. And when you get this idea, when it starts to click, it will dramatically improve your painting. To define composition, we could say it's thinking of the whole as you arrange the parts, which is both what you're trying to portray and the brush marks you're actually using, so that you get the effect you want. Let's look at that definition of composition again, and we'll define some of the terms we'll be using in this video. First, there's the picture plane, the surface, the canvas, or the paper that we're actually working on, and its size and its proportions. On that, we're arranging a number of masses or color shapes that tie together with the four sides and the proportions of the picture plane. And those masses are not necessarily just the objects, because look at the background and the table in the bottom left, and we can see it as being conceived as one large dark mass, even though it's two objects. Each of those masses has a value. You seldom need more than 5 or 6 values to create a painting. And the solid structure of the value masses is the foundation of any composition. They belong, they fit. The parts are in relationship to the whole. And let's look at color. Hue is the actual color of an object. It's red or green. That hue can be either dark or light, that's its value, and it can be either bright or dull, that's its intensity. Contained within that is the possibility for warm and cool color. And those are the tools for creating a variety of color shapes that add up to a painting, starting, I'll repeat, with the foundation of the value masses. Then there's the actual brush marks we use, the painterliness, to represent the illusion or representation on the picture plane. They can be invisible, as in an angle, or the painting can be about the paint marks, as much or even more than the representation, as in these paintings by Soutine and Diebenkorn. But most people are looking for a balance, like you see in this Korovin and Feshen and Soroya, somewhere between the mark seen as paint and at the same time creating an illusion. This is where it's important that the brush marks add to the total effect you're trying to create and don't break it apart by being busy or distracting. This painterliness or looseness comes with experience and confidence as a result of learning what we can leave out and what we can exaggerate. But a strong foundation of a few value masses will help you immeasurably if you want to push your color and be more painterly. Two things are essential here. One is to think in terms of the whole, and the other is to innocently train your eye to see how it's reacting to the picture plane, where it's being pulled, where if it's going towards what you want, or in fact away from what you want. So how do we do that? How do we start? First, we have to respond to something. Paul Vuillard said there is no art without poetic aim. You wouldn't be watching this videotape if you didn't have poetic responses to things. We see something, we respond, we're moved. That's what calls us to paint, or write, or dance. You have that, and your call is unique. No one responds quite the way you do. So for the rest of this tape, we're going to show examples and illustrations of how we can take that response and express it into abstract shapes that make powerful compositions. We'll strip everything away that doesn't add to that response, and we'll simplify it. Although most of the examples we'll be using are for landscape, the principles are common to any kind of representational painting. The first step to getting this to happen is to start walking around more. Whether this is a landscape or in your studio with a still life or a figure, the tendency is to arrive, set up, and immediately start painting. But be patient and be attentive. Isolate what you're responding to and sketch that. Spend more time with your sketchbook. It's like a writer's journal. These are your seed ideas, and go out for the morning just with your sketchbook and start thinking in terms of composition and not subject. Try and feel what it is you're responding to and pare the rest away. Reduce it. Design it. Think in terms of masses and their arrangement, not in terms of subjects and outlines. Obviously, if we're painting a figure or a group of trees, it's a subject, but it's how we see that's important and how we translate it abstractly. We need to structure compositions consciously. To do that, we can use armatures, and we're going to look at several examples, and we're also going to look at how horizontals and verticals help stabilize a composition. And then look at two old master paintings, one by Rubens and one by Roger van der Weyden, and look at the care and attention they took in structuring their armatures. Now, the arrangement of masses needs a foundation. It needs to hang onto something, and I call that an armature. An armature is the wire frame a sculptor uses to hang his clay on so that it'll stand up. A painting needs the same thing. Now, you may be wondering, how can you be applying rules to creating composition? But I think the idea of a convention is better. There's conventions in representational painting. Some of them are hundreds of years old, and artists have used them over and over again because they work. So I'm suggesting you rely on a few of them to see how you can get your paintings to work more effectively, and if further down the road they don't seem to be useful, then you can leave them behind. But it'll give you a structure to at least start with, so that you can start building more consistent, stronger compositions. So I want to go through, let's say, 6 examples of these armatures. And I don't want to make them like formulas that you have to stick to. They're just examples. The first would be an L shape, where we have the horizontal of the landscape and some vertical mass, maybe a tree. So it creates this L shape, or it could be up here with the L this way. But it's just creating an L. The second would be, say, an S shape, where again we have the horizontal, we have perhaps our center of interest here, off-center somewhat, and maybe there's a road or a street this way, and maybe it's the cloud shapes up here that move the eye through the landscape. The third, we could say, is a diagonal, where we might have, a mountain or something coming down to the sea with some, again, some boats or something and the water or the shore coming like this. And so the eye is moving through to the center of interest on the diagonal. A fourth might be something we call the fulcrum, where we have this large mass, heavy dark mass, again we have the horizontal, balanced with a small element, perhaps a person or a small tree. And it's kind of like that fulcrum, like a lever, balancing one against the other, the big against the small. Another one we just simply call grouping, where we've got, again, the horizon, and maybe we've got a group of boats, like that, or maybe a group of trees or something, that in and of itself is really the center of interest and pretty much most of the painting, and everything is subservient to that. And the last we could call radiating lines, where again we have the horizon, and maybe we've got some mountain shapes all coming down to our center of interest, and then a river coming off like this, and everything's kind of radiating from that center of interest. And you'll notice the center of interest, we don't put dead center, I have a little bit there, but over like this, and everything is leading to that. Let's look at the idea of armatures some more. Look at the next three images and how the horizontals and verticals placed off-center help to stabilize the elements of the picture to the picture plane. And in this landscape, how the S shape holds to the picture plane as well. The armature isn't a set of formulas and rules. It's not that I have to find an L or I have to find an S. It's a way to create a foundation for the value masses, to see it simply and boldly first, so all the effects you make in your finished painting hold together. So let me mention a couple of things of what not to do in compositions that seem to happen over and over again in student work. One is to put the center of interest right dead in the middle, which brings our eye there so fast that we don't tend to move around the composition. Another is to have really strong design elements coming out of one of the corners, a road or something. And what it tends to do is just take our eye out that corner and we just never come back. So if you have an element that you just can't do anything about but go out like that, you soften that edge and then it gets harder down here. So you use the design element but you just don't keep the eye moving out the corner. A third is having a field or something that does this. And what happens is you just go right out that corner. You might have things going on here. You just go right out there and you never come back again. And the last is having an element at the bottom, could be on a diagonal too, maybe a street, but we tend to enter the painting from the bottom. And if you've got this line, it's just like a hurdle we jump over and we land face first here trying to look at the rest of the painting. So somehow you've got to create a break, either a road or a break in whatever's going on, so that we can get into the painting, because this will just stop us. It's a hurdle to get in. Let's look at some of these composition problems more graphically. We can see here how the dark mass of trees on the right is pulling us out of the painting at the bottom right. One, because the hillside droops to the right so strongly, and two, because the base of the trees runs out of the bottom right-hand corner. Also, our eye is pulled out of the top right by the cloud. By decreasing the angle of the hillside and moving the shape away from running out of the bottom right-hand corner, and by moving the bottom of the cloud away from the top right-hand corner, the composition feels more stable and we stay in the picture plane. Here we can feel how the row of bushes in the foreground stops us from entering the painting easily. We trip over them as we move into the background. Also, the clouds are not designed, even though we might find them this way. By opening up the foreground, it gives us a path into the painting, and we easily move into the background. And the clouds now are arranged in such a way as they help move us into the painting. When you are planning your painting, one, make sure that anything that intersects the edge of the picture plane doesn't end right at the edge of the picture. It just looks unplanned, like you ran out of room, and pulls our attention to it. Incorporate objects into the painting. Incorporate the masses into the painting. And two, make sure the objects don't intersect in such a way that it's ambiguous their placement in space. We can't tell what's in front of the other. Overlaps are the easiest way to create depth. One of the most common things to happen is to find in the process of painting, objects get stylized or simplified to become almost generic. Each tree and mountain or flower or vase has a personality and a character like a face does, and your paintings will become more alive if you're always looking for that and draw it carefully and hold on to it during the painting process. This diagram shows what you might be confronted with in nature. There's not much order or pattern in the stream to help lead us into the painting. Often you'll have more order than this, but it's still a question of seeing what the need is to lead us into the painting and arranging the masses in the foreground to facilitate that. We need to impose the composition on the painting, on the landscape. It's not just a question of cataloging the chaotic jumble of water and rocks in front of us. And I'm going to show you two examples of complex armatures in two great master paintings. This is Venus and Adonis by Rubens. Let's look at the geometry he's using to orchestrate and balance a complex figure composition. He's divided the painting into fifths. The first touches the edge of Adonis's hand coming down the spear and ends at his foot. The second defines the front of Adonis's body and the putti's body and ends at Adonis's foot. The third cuts through the tree at the top, the side of Venus, and the white cloth Venus is sitting on. The fourth ends at Venus's foot. Now look how the diagonals joining the tops and bottoms of some of these fifths define a solid triangular shape and the placement of the figures. The first two diagonals are defining both sides of Venus's body. The next diagonal defines the back of the putti. The next two delineate the back of Adonis and the angle of his left leg. None of these lines are accidental. Rubens is aware of how easily things can go wrong in a complex painting, and so he's very careful to build a foundation for his composition. Now look at how Rubens moves us spatially. We follow the arm of the putti along the back of the dog, which guides our attention right, back into the landscape, across the water behind the figures, and then we're pulled forward around the side of Venus. Let's look at the painting again for a moment. This is the Deposition from the Cross by Roger van der Weyden. There isn't very much depth in this painting. It's almost like a relief about 3 feet deep. But the very complex arrangement of figures is structured on a series of circles. The first, you can see, follows the outside edge of St. John on the left and curves around Christ's body with Mary at the center of the circle. The second circle runs along the front of the figure holding Mary, around the side of her head, following the folds of her dress, the curve of the garment of the man in the richly decorated cloak, along Christ's arm, and through the eyes of the figure holding Christ, Joseph, and the man holding Mary. The third follows the fallen arm of Christ, joins Mary's hand, continues around the figure of Mary Magdalene on the right-hand side along her dress and back, and along the tops of the heads of the two figures and along Christ's raised arm. The fourth runs through the eyes of the figure holding Mary, passes along Mary's head, and goes along through the passages of light shining through the figures, around past the break at Christ's knees, in front of Mary Magdalene's head on the right, and the center of the circle falls on the line created by the vertical of the cross and the horizontal lintel behind the figures. Again, this is a very complex structure, and none of this was accidental in order to make sure that these figures held tightly within the picture plane and didn't have elements that were flying out of it. Let's look at 4 other wonderful Old Master paintings to see the structure they're using to create a strong composition. It shows their recognition of the necessity of designing a composition before putting brush to canvas. Obviously, we don't need to go through this every time we create a painting. But you can see how much planning and thought went into one of these early masterpieces long before they even picked up a paintbrush. My feeling is, if they had to go through all that to feel confident to begin, it probably won't hurt us to think a little of the underlying structure also before we start. The next section is very graphic. It shows how very sensitive good painters are to how the eye is moving through their painting, and how conscious composition is, that things are not left to chance. Let's look at this painting by Isaac Levitan. What I want to show you in this painting is how beautifully Levitan leads our eye around the picture plane without our getting diverted. When we're looking at this, we're brought from the foreground along the river, pulled towards the background down the creek. You can see how our attention is just pulled back that way and then held by that little birch and bank piece just at the back of the river, and then we start moving across the riverbank. We're not drawn left or right, up or down, and then across these birches in the background, and then we're moved up into that little patch of dark in the trees above, and then where attention is brought back to all the shadows below. down these birch trees, along these couple of darks in the bank, to this little bush which diverts our attention back into the painting. And that's how Levitan has structured it. Now there's a secondary movement also, which again will pull us back down the river in the same way. Our attention is pulled towards the back. But this time there's a dark just up there to the right. Our attention is then pulled across the clouds back to that dark, down the birch trees, along the field, those little darks, back to the bush and back into the painting. And he's very consciously creating these structures for our eye to move. We get such a feel of all the parts adding up to a coherent whole in this painting. Look at the bush that we said was diverting our attention in the bottom of the painting back up the river. And look what happens when that one little piece is removed. You can see now how the eye is actually brought out of the painting, is diverted out of the painting with that bush gone. And yet when it reappears, we can see its role in just furthering our eye through the picture plane rather than out of it. Whenever we want the eye to be pulled into a part of the painting, we can use gradation, the way Levitan has done here with the creek. But look what happens when we reduce that gradation. You see how flat the shape goes. In fact, now we tend to slide out the bottom right just as easily as move back into the painting. And yet when the gradation reappears, we just find the direction that Levitan wanted us to go is just firmly straight back into the sculpted depth of the picture. We're going to look at two shapes here to show how carefully Levitan has modulated all the parts to fit into the whole. First we're going to look at the little green field way at the back on the hillside. Look at how grayed that is because of atmospheric perspective. And yet if we intensify that color in that one color shape and make it more intense, it may be a more pleasing green on its own, but it now jumps away from the sense of being set back and is jumping forward from where we want it to be. And then when it gradates back, we can just see it falls back into place, back in the distance. The other thing I wanted to look at is that little bush down in the bottom right-hand corner that was deflecting our eye through the painting we were noticing before. But if you just look at the painting as a whole and you see that, it just has a very quiet role to play. But if we intensify the color of it, as it becomes intensified, if we just look at the whole painting, we can see that our eye now is getting distracted and pulled to that one part at the expense of the whole painting. And then as the color comes back to the way Levitan painted it, again our attention is just brought around the painting rather than distracted by that one part. And so in a good composition, each part is made to work in the context of the whole. The second painting we're going to look at is by the Russian Nikolai Timkov. It's a wonderful example of how he has modulated all the various parts to work so beautifully as a whole. He didn't walk around for days looking for something this balanced and harmonious. He saw it, he felt the idea, and then he imposed that idea on the landscape. He improved on it so that the composition, which was suggested by nature, was just pulled together, and we're going to look at various examples of what he's done here to make it work so effectively. First off, we're obviously entering the painting along this road at the bottom. And look at how beautifully he's modulated the grays and the greens in the foreground to create such a rich variety of hue with very small changes in value and intensity. So it doesn't distract our eye. It's rich, but it isn't distracting. And we're pulled back into the painting along the road to the wheat field, to the edge of the wheat field, which just stops our attention, and then we start sliding over to the left along the dark mass of trees up to that rich variety of purple buildings, and then across the trees, softened along the edge of the horizon, softened by atmospheric perspective, so that they sit way into the distance, and we're pulled right back to the stand of trees on the far right-hand side, which stops our eye, and then we notice that little slight line of darker wheat that pulls our eye back into the edge of the wheat field, right back into the painting. As I did with the last painting by Levitan, I'm going to make changes to the painting, And as you follow these examples, it's important to notice how your eye moves innocently on the picture plane as the changes are made. This will help you when you look at your own paintings of how your eye is really being moved in your composition, not what you hope it's doing. And this one skill will dramatically improve your painting. The first change we'll look at is the strong gradation in the bottom right that Timkoff uses to push us into the painting. By eliminating that gradation, the eye slides right out of the bottom right. The convention of using gradations like this to move our eye has been used by artists for hundreds of years. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in developing better, more effective compositions. That gradation is just moving us into the painting. The second shape we'll look at is the stand of trees on the horizon on the far right-hand side. You see what happens when we increase their value, how our attention is now led out of the picture plane, out of the composition on the right-hand side. And when it's returned to its original value, we can see how our eye is again attracted to that line in the wheat field, and again we're pulled into the painting. Thirdly, we'll look at the edge of the wheat field. Look what happens when we darken the value of that. Now our eye is stopped by it. We don't travel back into the picture. It forms a barrier. If we gradate the edge of that wheat field so that it's darker on the right, you can see it acts as an arrow. It pulls us off to the right and out of the painting. If we gradate it to the left, it pulls us into the painting as Timkoff planned, but it's too forceful. As he planned it, it's a subtle shape to lead us across the composition over to those trees. In this painting by Dennis Miller Bunker, a contemporary of Sargent, how does your eye move? Obviously there's a strong sweep around the edge of the water past the boat and the small tree that moves right over to the right-hand side of the painting. Plus there's the dark mass of the trees, simpler on the left and more complex on the right, that pulls us into the painting. This all leads to the little boat and then to the tree on the right, which stops our eye from continuing out of the painting. Its reflection heads us back down to the large clump of weeds in the foreground. Next, I want to show you how detail can be distracting. Bunker simplified the dark masses of trees to be a design element that works for him. Look what happens if we introduce the kind of complex edges of leaves and of sky holes that would have been there when he actually painted. You see how distracting it is. And yet, when we return to how he had it, we again experience trees as a functional design element in the composition. Bunker has pushed his idea. He's imposed design to his purpose. Let's eliminate the small tree in the far right-hand side, and you'll see how the attention is just left hanging in the background and even slides out of the right-hand side of the painting. But with that little tree, our attention is again directed down the edge of the picture plane back into the painting. This is a very tonal painting. If we exaggerate the intensity of color of one of the parts in the composition, you can see now how our attention is dragged back left rather than continuing around to the right. It arrests our attention from the movement we were just talking about. This painting is keyed to be very tonal, so more intense color isn't appropriate. That one color might be more appealing if you like vibrant color, but in the context of the whole composition it's clearly disruptive. Color has to work relative to the whole. And finally, I'd like you to look at the beautiful balance of these four shapes, as if they exist in space on the edge of a huge circle. We've looked at three landscapes. Let's look at a still life by Chardin. Notice the major horizontal and vertical he uses to anchor the composition to the picture plane. He moves us up into the painting and back down into his center of interest where he has the hardest edges and the greatest contrasts. If we darken the background around the white bowl on the right, you can see how it pulls our attention over to that edge too forcefully. As with the highlights on the fish's head, which if too bright, pulls our attention up distracted to the top of the painting. When we talk of moving the eye around the picture plane, something to watch out for is creating eye traps. That is, our eye is moved into but can't get out of a spot in the composition. It could be right where we want to lead the eye, or inadvertently somewhere else. We want to guide where the eye is moving. Keep it interested and moving about the picture plane, not getting it trapped in one spot and static. This example shows the usefulness of gradation to move the eye. The tower on the hillside is where our attention goes, but clearly the gradation takes us off to the left and back around the composition. A gradation is a very useful tool to move your eye through a major compositional mass. But note that your eye moves from darker to lighter, as this example makes clear. A final thing is when you have a road or river or something moving back into the landscape, you'll find the feeling of movement or structure is stronger if you use straight lines and angles rather than just long, loopy curves. If you really look at a road or a river going back into the landscape, you'll find that it actually is moving in a series of straight segments. So let's get started. First thing I wanted to show you is some viewfinders. When you're out, actually even if you're in the studio, but when you're out in the landscape, there's so much information that you want to be able to isolate it and isolate those abstract shapes. And a viewfinder is a really important tool for that. This one here is taking 3 standard sizes and dividing them into thirds. And these lines are really useful things to move major elements of the composition up to, particularly creating centers of interest in these 4 spots. This here, the red, what it does is it neutralizes color so that it's easier to figure out what the values are without getting distracted by the brilliance of the color. So this is a very good one. There's another one here which is just easy to use in the sense that it's so small, but it goes from everything from the narrowest composition right up the square. And it also has a hole here against the neutral gray in order to be testing colors. Now the third possibility, if you're out and about and not with that viewfinder, is just to use your fingers. And you can just do something like that and bringing them up to your eye like this and just getting them, depending on how far and how close you have them, just blocking off what you want to see. Because these 4 lines here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you place them on the landscape, are the 4 most important lines on the composition. And it'll make all the difference about how the painting is going to turn out. A very useful way to divide the picture plane to build a composition is to divide it in thirds. By lining major masses against 1 or 2 of those thirds, and by putting the center of interest around one of those intersections, we create irregular rather than symmetric design. It's amazing without this how easy it is to put things right in the middle, very static and usually uninteresting. If you look at a book of paintings you like, you will find that artists often line things up like this in painting after painting because it just feels right, intuitively. In the first photograph, look what happens when we digitize the color masses on the computer, creating simpler color masses. And then we have a sketch of how those masses might be arranged in a thumbnail in preparation to paint. It's like the value of squinting, of simplifying the masses to reduce the detail and to see them more in their painted masses. We can find different ways to crop this image to make good compositions. In the final one, we'll digitize it as if we were squinting and see it not in terms of detail, but masses. Masses of differing contrast. Notice here the contrast is subtle, close in value and intensity, changing a little in hue, while here, of course, the contrast is strong and the shape's dynamic. We need to be very conscious of contrasts of hue, value, and intensity because they are the fundamental tools we have for painting. So emphasizing contrasts where we want the eye to go and de-emphasizing contrasts where we don't is about as fundamental an idea in making paintings as there is. Let's go to a painting that I did of this subject. The more we can see what we want to paint in terms of color shapes and lay them down that way, boldly and cleanly, the fresher and more lively our paintings will become. This diagram shows the way I've arranged the composition in terms of eye movement. The gradation from top left into the painting, we see an increase in the intensity of the yellow. The gradation from the bottom left is a change in value and intensity as we move into the painting. And the eye is led across the cypresses to the most intense color on the right-hand side. We'll take another landscape. We'll see how by cropping it we make it more intense, more interesting, and then we'll see an interpretation I did of it, including obviously elements that weren't in the original landscape to make it more dramatic. Here again, we'll show two croppings that both are interesting as paintings, and then to see this digitized version that we can see as color masses, as if we would paint that with marks of paint, again, like squinting, to reduce the detail, to simplify it. So we look to get away from subjects and details and think more in terms of simplicity and abstract color shapes. Whether we're doing landscape, figures, interiors, still life, arranging the major abstract masses within the 4 lines of your picture plane is going to be your foundation and is worth a lot of thought before starting to paint. Here are 2 other images with figures. By arranging the placement and emphasizing some things and deleting others in the painting, I was able to make them, I think, stronger and more intriguing. To begin with in this process, look for compositions that translate into paint. So often I talk about this idea, and students go off and they find something with a mass of frilly trees or a latticed porch, which isn't that it's impossible to paint or even maybe that it's a good composition, but it's so hard to see abstractly in terms of shapes and masses. The tendency is to get overwhelmed by the detail. Look for compositions where you can see how the brush marks will translate into the objects you're looking at. One thing that should be apparent now is that I'm saying composition is conscious. It's not left to chance. There's a famous British watercolor painter and teacher named Ron Ransom who taught for decades and had other teachers come and teach at his school for decades. And at the end of that period, when he retired, he said, you know, it's the teacher's responsibility to bring something to the student. But the student also has a responsibility. And the one complaint he had with students is, why don't they make thumbnail sketches? A thumbnail is like a road map. It has 2 functions. First, it tells you where you're going. And second, it tells you when to stop. If you've ever designed a house with an architect, he doesn't start with rulers and straight edge and squares. He stays very fluid with the idea, okay, we'll have the living room here, we'll have the entrance here, and you entertain a lot, so we'll have the dining room here, and obviously the kitchen here, and we need this kind of flow. I mean, he keeps things very, very fluid in terms of movement and possibility before ever committing to the idea of ruler and straight edge and how far and how the distance is and how many feet. And this is a good analogy for how we can look for compositions. We stay very fluid, looking for those first 4 most important lines of the